I'm Kyle.
And I'm Tommy.
And we're pissed. Why are we mad, Tommy?
Well, let me tell you. Earlier this year, a bill called the Endangered Species Management Self-Determination Act, wow, what a mouthful, was introduced to Congress. This bill would dramatically reduce the effectiveness of the Endangered Species Act as it seeks to make many aspects of the ESA voluntary, and puts much of the power of the bill into the hands of the states rather than the federal government. For example, this bill would require that both the Department of the Interior and the Department of Commerce obtain consent from states on whether or not to add a species to the list if the species occurs in said state. In addition to this, Congress would now be given the power to control whether the list goes into effect or not.
So, the current method allots power to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is subject to judicial review. It was designed as such to remove any manipulation or involvement from Congress, as the decision-making process involved in listing a species is pretty complex. It requires critical understanding of really intense scientific literature and data, which is too easily subjected to manipulation by those with vested interests in industries which disregard delicate ecosystems and the regulations required to keep those in check.
Rather than staying on the ESA listing until significant recovery occurs, species would be removed from the list after just a mere 5 years, but includes the option for the Secretary of the Interior to reapply and renew their listing.
Right, so currently citizens have the option to petition the Department of Interior if they believe a species should be added or removed from the list. This proposed law removes this option and makes it even more difficult for the Department of Interior to relist a species.
First, we should probably get down to basics. How a bird becomes a listed species.
So, what is the ESA? When was it introduced?
Well, Kyle, the Endangered Species Act is a piece of bipartisan legislation from 1973 passed under President Richard Nixon, aimed at protecting endangered or threatened plant and animal species.
Cool. Yeah, so the Secretary of Interior receives species information, and based on 5 factors, determines whether or not an organism needs to be classified as endangered or potentially threatened. The 5 factors are as following. First, the present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat or range. Second, overutilization of commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes. Third, disease or predation. Fourth, the inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. Finally, number 5, other natural or man-made factors affecting its continued existence.
And the Secretary of the Interior shall make determinations solely based on the best scientific and commercial data available to them.
So, how is it implemented? First, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services lists the endangered species. This list can be found here.
Second, listed species are required to have a designated critical habitat.
A recovery plan that defines criteria to downlist or delist a species must be created after that.
And finally, the agencies must engage in consultation to prevent take that jeopardizes listed species.
If you want the definition of take, you can find that here as well. The list does not only include animals, however. It's a vast list that includes plants as well as animals that you probably don't think of on a day-to-day basis, such as invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, or fish. The list also isn't specific to United States or its territories. This list is global and includes animals from everywhere. Species which are included on the list aren't only endangered either. As stated earlier, there's also a classification of threatened, which means that the species might be close to being endangered and necessarily isn't on the brink of extinction, but is at risk. So that's kind of the gist of the Endangered Species Act. So what's wrong with the Endangered Species Management and Self-Determination Act? Sounds pretty good from the surface.
For starters, it requires states to permit a species listing if the species is found within that state's range. Removing the ability of the Department of the Interior to regulate interstate species is a reckless move. This gives the decision-making power to state politicians, who are free to ignore the assessments made by the scientists who determined the species was at risk.
Right, so there's a really good example that backs up why this is a bad thing. But in order to give that, we have to go back to 1985, when the West Virginia northern flying squirrel was listed as endangered. If, at the time, the ESA required each state within which the squirrel's range fell, there would be no guarantee that Virginia and West Virginia would both work together to make sure that the squirrel would be protected. But the law was designed better than this. The Interior didn't have to have express permission from the respective state governments. The regulations which protected the species were enforced, and populations have since rebounded. This is a success story.
Next, the proposed amendment requires the species to be removed after a meager 5 years of being on the list. Many studies, though, have concluded that this isn't nearly enough time to see a substantial change in the species numbers.
The regulations that we need to be enforced are long-term in nature and require several generations to pass before there's any sort of visible benefit given to the species that they target. And if you want to know how we came to that conclusion, you can check our sources here.
Finally, the proposed amendment would remove the ability of citizens to petition for the removal or addition of species from the list.
This also makes it much harder for the Interior to reapply for the inclusion of a species on the list. And if the 5-year passes as well, so what improvements should be made? What about the ESA is actually flawed? There are a lot of valid concerns out there that should be addressed. For example, according to this source, under the current process, populations fall to nearly irreversible levels, and as a species continues to decline and approach extinction, management options narrow, costs rise sharply, and the sense of urgency grows nerve-wrackingly high. And there might be too much of a focus on charismatic species that the public get excited about in order to maintain or increase funding. It just really doesn't target what really should be targeted.
According to this source, the inability of the government to fully empower the agencies to implement the law has been the most notable failure of the Endangered Species Act. Listing has not matched need, recovery expenditures do not match need or agency set priorities, and critical habitat determinations have lagged.
Yeah, critical habitat has not been designated for the majority of listed taxa, and recovery plans remain largely unfinished for some of the most highly funded species.
Funding for species recovery is insufficient to complete recovery tasks and is so highly skewed that justifications for the distribution are sparse.
And with limited staff and high rates of Section 7 consultation, the agencies are under strain to adequately, fully consider potential impacts for timely review.
These criticisms of ESA implementation derive directly from the lack of ESA funding. The aforementioned study found that funding for recovery programs had a strong positive effect on continual positive population trends. But it's difficult to clearly assess whether it's time, money, or taxonomy that influences improving status.
And given the modest government expenditure toward the implementation of the Endangered Species Act, stranding many species with few proactive conservation efforts, recovery and delisting are often not the expected outcome.
There are so many issues with time lag, as the time between applied conservation efforts and recovery is likely to be long. We do not expect dramatic recovery of recoverable species in one or few generations of a listed taxa.
Any proposed amendments should really focus more on that, and not gutting the authority of the bill.
Yeah, the issues that the ESA is experiencing now are not ones that this bill addresses.
Wah, wah, wah. Final thoughts! You may be asking yourself,
What now?
call your representative, and voice your concern over this bill.
Click this link above to find out who your representatives are.
So, if you're asking,
Should I really be supporting the ESA?
think about the following facts and figures, which come from here.
The Endangered Species Act has overwhelming bipartisan support amongst the public, and passed Congress almost unanimously back in 1973.
And the proposed amendment is dedicated to reducing the authority of the Endangered Species Act by handing over said authority to a divided Congress. We don't need further politicization of science, and we especially don't need to add conservation strategies to the list of things that Congress already dictates.
The public largely believes that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should be the ones with control over classification, not members of Congress.
We urge you to think about the following facts too, which you can get from this source.
According to a 2015 national poll run by the Tulchin Research Group, 90% of participants issued some form of support for the bill, and 71% of participants believe scientists should be the ones making the decision.
This poll had a 4% margin of error and had a sample size that was large enough to make its results generalizable to the national sentiment. So no matter how you spin it, the majority of US voters still support the Endangered Species Act and the scientists making the decisions for it.
So how do we move forward?
First, we need to redefine what success means under the Endangered Species Act.
Some would say it's the rate at which species are delisted due to meaningful recovery.
We assert that this falls short of reality and fails to address species which are actively recovering from regulations created thanks to the ESA, but have not yet reached the benchmark set by the Department of the Interior. This doesn't mean the Act isn't effective or that it's unsuccessful. The ESA is still doing what it was created to do. It just needs to create a broader understanding of what a conservation success story really looks like.
Analysts actually consider the bill to be pretty successful when their studies don't exclude species which haven't been delisted, but are experiencing pretty significant improvements since their listing. The attempts to undermine the authority, effectiveness, and prevalence of the Endangered Species Act have dramatically negative ecological consequences, and we just can't deal with those right now. And it's up to us to remind our representatives that we won't sacrifice our world to protect their wallets. Give them a call.
Damn. If you missed the links that we posted during the video, you can find them below down in the description box.
And we really want everyone to do their own research on this.
We encourage you to form your own opinions, and we thank you for watching our video today.